Welcome, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. I suppose my name is Daly-Gherabi. I'm a partner for social impact with Boyden Executive Search. I suppose at Boyden we work with charities trying to find that sort of highest calibre of talent, and so have a really good understanding of the landscape of third sector governance. But obviously it continues to evolve and there are ever increasing challenges. So it's more crucial than ever to really get under the skin so that charities have the best chance of flourishing and, for sustainability going forward. In this webinar, we'll explore the dynamics, challenges and opportunities that charitable boards face in the modern era. We'll also delve into the essential components of what can drive that success. The questions for this session, please go into the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, so that any questions that you would like to put to the panelists, we can pick up from there and then answer towards the end of the webinar. I'd like to introduce my colleague.
Josh Blackman. So I lead our interim practice for social impact. I've been aboard Boyden for almost 3 years now, and I work very closely with Karen as part of an integrated offering. It's lovely to see everyone.
So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our panelists and thank you very much for giving your time today. By way of background, I thought that I would start by just giving a brief background into their careers and experience. And we have a mixture of chair, CEO, Chief People Officer, HRD, and trustee. So we have a broad spectrum of opinions today. So first off, Dr. Alice Maynard, CBE, began her career in the IT industry, working in a range of roles around software development and localization. Following a stint at the rail industry, working on EDI issues, she founded Future Inclusion, which is designed to help leaders improve organizational performance through inclusive practice. Alice now has a portfolio of non-exec and business advice roles and is an executive coach and mentor. Through Future Inclusion, she advises a number of businesses across private, public and third sector organizations. She currently sits as a non-exec for the Financial Conduct Authority, where she chairs the People Committee, and is chair and pro-chancellor of the University of York Council. She's also a member of the Government Commercial Office for Remuneration Committee. In 2022, she stood down from HMRC, where she chaired the People Committee and was a board member until 2021 for Transport for London. 2008-14, Alice led the board of Scope, the disability charity, rebuilding its financial and management capabilities. This led her and other third sector colleagues to establish the Association of Chairs. And this was really to improve chairing across all sectors. She's been Sunday Times Non-Executive Director of the Year. Sorry, I need to put my teeth in. And has received an honorary doctorate from University of York and was awarded CBE in 2015. Alice, welcome. Dr. Philip Goodwin, welcome and thank you, has been the Chief Executive of the Voluntary Service Overseas since March 2015. He was previously the CEO of Tree Aid, an NGO that works on agroforestry in dryland Africa. And before that, spent 11 years working with the British Council, where he held various leadership positions in Kenya, Uganda, Pakistan, and Belgium. Philip's also been a community development volunteer in Timbuktu, Mali. He's got a PhD and MSc in rural resource planning and environmental policy, and a degree in agricultural economics. Philip is a non-executive director of the International Civil Society Centre, which is based in Berlin, whose mission is to strengthen the impact and resilience of international civil society organisations. He's also a trustee of the Royal National Lifeboat Institute, the not-for-profit search and rescue organisation, whose mission is to save lives at sea. He co-authored with Tony Page the leadership book From Hippos to Gazelles, How Leaders Create Leaders, and takes over as the CEO for UNICEF UK in September 2024. So welcome, Philip. Mike Maddick has had a varied career, is the Director of Resources at the Children's Trust, which is a charity supporting children with brain injuries and neurodisabilities. He has 25 years of people and culture experience gained within the financial services. This has included organisations such as the Royal Bank of Scotland, UBS and JP Morgan. He's had a number of significant global roles within corporate HR departments with a focus on business partnering, talent, graduate resourcing, and development and executive hiring. So outside of work, Mike is a trustee for Platform Cricket, which engages with 15,000 inner city children in cricket every year in an inclusive way. So welcome to all the panelists. I hope your teeth are better fitted than mine. And without further ado, I'd like to ask each panelist in turn to provide some thoughts on what you believe makes an effective board in 2024 and beyond. And maybe I could start with you, Alice.
Thank you, Karen. So I'm not sure that what makes an effective charitable board in 2024 has changed all that much from what makes an effective board in any sector at any time. I think there's some real fundamentals that you just need in any board to make it effective and high performing. And of course, given my background, you would expect me to say that the most important of those is to have a diversity of views that's actually often created by a diversity of experience. It may be just something about the way you think, but that's often bred by experience. And sometimes that arises from diversity of identity, but it doesn't always. I mean, we're always looking for diversity of identity, but that doesn't necessarily create diversity of thought. So then obviously keeping a firm eye on the vision, mission and values, review them regularly and set clear strategy within those parameters and monitor that implementation of that strategy closely. And those are the fundamentals of a good working board. But one thing I guess that's changed most clearly is the financial context. So local authority funding is tight or non-existent, and the cost of living crisis has impacted the donor base. And so this puts strain on delivery and that impacts potentially your charitable purposes. And it drives difficult choices between stopping, maintaining and starting initiatives. So but the really important thing in that then is to keep that really strong understanding of what is that purpose and those values that you are working within in order that you can make those difficult choices well. And additionally, I think there's a significant change in social attitudes and the willingness to recognise evidence base. And we therefore may need to take a different approach to fundraising and service delivery because members of the public don't really accept numbers necessarily, including what our financial and social impact is. And it's partly because of the way in which we see data and see how it's used to misrepresent or confuse us. But actually, I think it's a bit deeper than that. I think it's about a whole thing about no trust or serious lack of trust. But none of this, in my view, changes those fundamentals. So that clear purpose, those strong values, the well thought through strategy, looking at the external context and working within it, flexing and shuffling your priorities, and that I think will carry the board through really difficult times. And of course, as a founding trustee of the Association of Chairs, I have to say that the role of the chair is critical in all of this to keep the board focused and help them hold their nerve through difficult times. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. That's been really, really helpful. Philip, can I come to you next?
Well, yes, just to say, well, agree with everything that Alice has said, and I suppose just to build on it, I suppose from my perspective, certainly both from my chief executive roles, but also my trustee roles, I think it's really important that a board and non-executive have a sense of shared joint endeavour, and that it's really important that there is clarity between the non-exec and the executive, that there is a joint responsibility to deliver on the mission. I suppose the next thing that I would say is that it's really important that the exec and non-exec understand their respective roles and are able to stay in those roles and understand how they relate to each other. So as Alice has said, the board are ultimately the guardians of the charity's purpose. And as Alice has said, they're responsible, accountable for strategy, and their role is also around, as she said, scrutiny and support. They are also the employer ultimately. Certainly, they're normally the ones who appoint the chief executive. I think what has changed is as Alice has sort of alluded to, there is this additional weight because of the legal and fiduciary responsibility that board members have. But I think more importantly, the weight of public expectations. And again, Alice has mentioned this. And I think one of the challenges for boards now is this aspect of fear associated with their legal and fiduciary responsibility. And that can be an inhibitor in terms of them fulfilling their role. Ideally, I mean, a board should not be undertaking executive roles or dropping down to the weed of executive function. As a chief executive, you would expect me to be saying that, but they should be seeking assurance from the non-executive. And for me, a good board understands the whole notion of dispersed leadership, in that it allows autonomy for the executive, but that autonomy is earned through performance. So it's assured through performance. As Alice, I think, has said, ways of working are really important. So for me, aspects of curiosity, reflection, appreciative inquiry, clarity over why information is needed and the implications of that information are really important for the board to understand, and for the executive to understand how they provide that information. I think from the executive perspective that they really need to understand the need to support the non-exec in making the decisions they need to make. One of the traps I think executives fall into is that they think they have to manage the board. I think as soon as an executive is moving into managing the board, then there is the risk of failure. And I think the executive need to recognise that what I call the sort of the lighthouse challenge, that by definition, non-exec are only coming to the organisational business from time to time. They're not living it 24/7 as often the executive are. So making sure that the executive are reminding the board why we're looking at certain things, what they're looking at, why it's coming back, reminding them of the thread of discussions between meetings is really important in terms of good practice. I think it's really important in terms of maintaining roles. It's really important for the exec and non-exec to review and agree their ways of working with each other. Preferably write it down, preferably review it to make sure that you're living up to the way that you want to work and you want to deliver. Let me stop there.
Okay, that's lovely. Philip, thank you very much. Mike, can we come to you?
Yeah, thank you. An awful lot of what's been said already, I think, is very relevant, but maybe the bits I'd pick out just from different roles that I performed on board. So I think as a CEO, the relationship with the chair is critical, and there are challenge and support has been mentioned is very important, and performance I do think is incredibly important in that role. But it's also recognizing as a chair that it is fundamentally a very lonely role and people need support, and that's a really important part of that relationship, being really clear, clarity of expectations, support, not unlimited, but support has to come with challenge. And there's a fundamental commitment to you as a CEO and to support that. All CEOs come and develop, and it can, as I said, it can be vulnerable and lonely at times. One thing we've not mentioned necessarily enough, but tight chairing is really important as well. Boards can spend an awful lot of time talking about the same things in a circular way, and There's lots of very basic things around about the right papers, the right time, good company secretaries, good chairs, well managed, that I think makes people really effective. And that brings you into being a trustee. And as a trustee role, you don't have a huge amount of time. You're doing this, in my case, alongside a full-time role, families, a spouse who works, and all those kind of bits. And so you want to make sure that you're really tight with that use of time, that it's effective. I think it was Philip mentioned that the quality of kind of the information, so that people can assure it. And I think with the trustee, one thing maybe to mention more would be just linking directly into the organisation. You know, the board is not an end in itself. The board is there to support the organisation. And one thing with trustees is they need to spend time with the beneficiaries, the people you're helping, and understand that. And I absolutely encourage that. I think that gives a very, very helpful perspective. The danger of sort of professional trustees or professional non-execs is that engagement with the organisation, the fundamentals of the organisation. And then finally, just as people director, again, my words building on what people have said, the contract between the groups, make it explicit, not implicit. So be really clear about how that works. Recognise positive and destructive behaviours. And one of the things I think is sort of I've seen in our organisation in the past is what I call false harmony, where everything seems to be very pleasant within the board, but actually you're not having the conversation in the room. I'd also say avoid any decisions outside the room. It's really, really important as a chair and an executive that these conversations happen inside. And to Philip's point, actually, around about preparing for the board, I think that's one of the worst things. Where you want to be is, as a chair, as an executive, is you can have those conversations rather than you're managing a message, because then the trustees are not going to get that level of assurance if you're managing that. And if you feel you need to, again, that comes down to why the explicit contracting rather than implicit. And two-way relationships outside the board do help. I think there are some things which, although you want that visibility of decision-making and within the board, you do need to pair up some of the executives. We find the kind of linking of executives with certain areas and certain remits within the organisation is really helpful. There's some shaping work that goes on outside the board because time is limited, and that tends to lead to, I think, a much better exchange when you get to the board, better papers, better thoughtfulness in terms of how that particular information is presented. So those will all be the big things. But the single biggest thing for me is you are there to support the children. In our case, go and spend time with the children, whichever of those roles, and really understand what that's about.
No, that's brilliant. Lovely. Thank you, Mike. And thank you all three. There's some really, really good points to come out there. And I think what I'd like to do is just sort of delve into a few of them, maybe in a little bit more detail. I would ask anybody who's participating in the webinar, please do put the questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And we will try and get our panelists to answer those questions as we inch towards the end of the webinar. So a question to you all, really, diversity and inclusion. And obviously, Alice, you have a particular interest in this because you've done so much work in this area, but I know that it's close to both Philip and Mike's hearts as well. So I wonder whether we might start with you. And I suppose, particularly in the charitable sector, still representation of diverse views, ways of thinking, ethnicity, whatever it might be, is still relatively low. And so I suppose when boards are thinking about how can they improve their representation of the communities they represent, can you give us some idea of your sort of thoughts on that?
So that was to me, wasn't it?
Please, Alice. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that we often don't think about when we are looking at engaging a more diverse board is we don't think about what the experience is of the diverse person when they arrive on the board. And that comes down to a lot of the behaviours that Mike and Philip have been talking about, where if you are not behaving inclusively, if I can use that as a kind of umbrella term, then someone can come along with all your lovely words about we welcome, etc., we want lots of diverse people on our board, and they do not then feel as if their voice is heard. And Mike's pointed out that trustees are unpaid. They are giving their time voluntarily. It's usually fitting in with And so if you don't feel as if your voice is being heard, there's no point in being there. And communities often talk to each other. So, you know, one of the ways to get other people from a community is to make sure that, I mean, it's not always the case. I'm always nervous about generalizing in this space. But I think that welcome is really important. But I worry about the concept of representation. So if we think that we are going to get someone from an ethnic minority on the board, and that somehow they're going to be able to bring with them all the experience and the wonder of different communities, and we're going to rely on them to help us serve the children from an ethnic minority that we might be wanting to serve in our charity or whatever, we are on a hiding to nowhere. So I think we think very oddly sometimes about diversity, and I find that really frustrating. It's very 1980s in my view.
I agree. Thank you. Philip, do you want to come in? I can see you've been nodding furiously there, as has Mike.
Yeah, well, you know, I think Alice has really, you know, hit the nail on the head around, particularly around issues of representation. So I think, you know, I think we have moved on, certainly in our thinking, but boards are having to catch up. And my experience is that boards are still quite a way behind in thinking about. They tend to think about diversity, if I can be blunt, and therefore are linking it to representation instead of thinking about inclusion. And they're also making the mistake of thinking about diversity and inclusion as the right thing to do, which it is, but they're not thinking about actually fundamentally it's about the performance and improving the performance of your board, and that actually getting a diversity of views and an inclusive practice improves performance. It's about ultimately the effectiveness. And as Mike said, you know, ultimately we're trying to deliver missions in not-for-profits, and therefore you want to maximize that. And therefore it's really about performance. So I think that's, you know, that to me is really important. And I think, as Alice has said, I think one of the things that's not really understood is people think about diversity. And if I can be blunt, I've heard people say things like, well, I'm committed to diversity, I treat everyone the same. And as soon as you've said that, you've failed, particularly around inclusion. And this is the point that Alice is making. You've got to understand that when people come into a room, how do we hear their voice? So why do we find certain voices, in inverted commas, difficult? Why do we dismiss certain ways of presenting ideas? How do, you know, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we hold difference in the room? And a key aspect here is the chair, I think, and the self-awareness, collective self-awareness of the board. So it's not easy, but I think it's really important to consider those aspects. Boards tend to have a habit of recruiting in their likeness, and Alice has alluded to that. So you have to think about how do you get beyond the networks that you already know. If you're going to be inclusive and diverse, you have to move beyond the networks you already know, and you have to think about your behaviour. I know that some boards are moving away from skill-based boards to thinking about competency-based recruitment as a way of widening resource pools and not going with the usual suspects. But I'm now going to leave Mike with a hard challenge of now building on what Alice and I said, because I'm agreeing with Alice.
I know, Paul, I won't leave you to last next time, Mike.
I'm literally none of that I disagree with. I'll pull out two of the bits. The reality versus the words. Alice's point is so important. You know, you can say all you want, you support these things, but people experience it by how you behave. And if you don't address those behaviours, and if you're not aware of them in some cases, you know, boards recruiting their likeness, I think, for certainly the experience I've had. But there's also just the, you know, practical issues with that, which is if I look at our board, you know, we're looking at 20 to 30 days per year that somebody's volunteering in terms of our context. And that absolutely creates limitations. I can't tell you I know exactly how to overcome that, but you're talking about somebody who's working 20, 30 days, they're unpaid, and therefore by nature of that trustee role, there's going to be limitations on who can do that. Some of those may be people at end of career example, some of those people who, you know, can afford not to work and do those 20 days, but certainly where we've got people who are working as well. And if you're trying to broaden the pool of people that are coming into the board, people who are working struggle with those kind of commitments. standards, you know, even if we minimise them. So some of the things we tried to do, we look at co-opted membership for sure. We also look, you know, one of the smaller charity board benefits, I think, with platform cricket for people who want to be a trustee is that time commitment. Be really clear about it. And I think that making boards, forget the Children's Trust, but just generally, there are lots of boards and lots of different boards out there and lots of ways to contribute to it. And I would encourage everybody to go and do that, because the other thing is, I think a lot of people perceive that people don't want them. So you look at an eminent panel like this, do you have to have all of those things in your experience to be a board member? And my experience is not, you know, people almost self-select themselves out. Well, I've not got this, I've not got that. What I love about platform cricket is you have this variety of people from a variety of backgrounds, because it's not a huge commitment, and it's something which is it's a cause, you know, just essentially getting inner city children who have very low levels of sports provision into cricket as a gateway into the sport. It's about 5 or 6 days per year. Virtually anybody can do that. And actually, a lot of those smaller boards, it's quite practical skills. So it's skills that people would have in their day-to-day lives around about supporting HR, supporting finance and things like that. So I think that if you're talking about big boards, sometimes it's around about their structure that makes them inaccessible, as well as behaviours, I think, make them far more inaccessible. And you have to address that, as Alice and Phillips have done. But on a positive note, I'd say for people who want to be trustees, there are accessible boards there, just in terms of time and capacity, which I would hugely encourage people to do. Don't get put off by what you perceive as the requirement to have done senior and significant roles to be an effective board member. That just isn't the case.
No, I think that's really helpful. Thank you for that, Mike. And I think it is that journey, isn't it, about how much time you've got to give. And I think we are demanding more of our trustees, more of our chairs, and there is no financial remuneration. Going back to Philip and Alice's point, you know, the legal responsibilities, the fiduciary responsibilities weigh quite heavy on some people. So moving on, I'd just like to have a look now at sort of governance and accountability. And what best practices can charitable boards adopt to ensure there's a sort of more robust governance and accountability, so that there can be greater trust and transparency with stakeholders and also the givers? Because, you know, as Alice said at the beginning, I think trust has been breaking a little bit with how some charitable organisations maybe have conducted their fundraising in the past, which provides extra challenges. So maybe Mike, can I start with you? I said I wouldn't leave you till last.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I think just in terms of governance accountability, just 5 kind of ways in which boards I think limit themselves in my experience. One is disorganisation. And there's a lot of just very basic work around governance in the background between the chair, the company secretary, the CEO, in terms of making sure that the right stuff is talked about and that you have those conversations well in board. I think support and challenge we talked about. Ideally, it's the high support, high challenge model. So you're trying to make sure that, you know, boards are there to be challenging. But if they just become a war zone, then the danger is that you don't have those honest and open conversations. And so it's trying to find that balance of the way you inquire, the way you ensure, which we talked about. I use the word false harmony, but I think it's really important. It can seem like everybody's getting on really, really well, but if you're not talking about the really difficult things, that is not effective.
Yeah,
I think it was Alice said it right at the start. You know, you've got to be able to have those conversations in the room, and that does take time. And as we said, making sure the exec and the board are aligned. A classic thing would be, how do boards take bad news? So everybody loves a bit of good news, but how do boards take bad news? And if the bad news goes down a sort of a destructive kind of circling the drain, you know, set of behaviours, then unsurprisingly, people are not going to tell you the bad news. They're going to manage the message, and that's ultimately fruitless for boards. Are you relevant to the staff? And in our case, the children and young people, I think governance accountability can be very remote. What's a company secretary is a good question. Do most people know? But a lot of boards aren't, I think, relevant to either of those groups in the way they should be. And it's really important. The trust bit is an interesting one, not something I thought about, particularly Alice, but yeah, I get that. But actually, we see that within the organisation as well. What do the SLT do? What do the board do? What do they spend all their time? And I think that connectivity and just even the basics of, are you friendly when people come and present? That's such a basic thing. But most people are sitting there, this is the biggest day of their week. They're scared to death. And if everybody looks grumpy because you've had a difficult conversation, how does that feel for them? So I think that's a chair and an executive requirement. And then finally, the biggest one, I think, is just this lack of trust, openness and transparency. Managing messages, not really getting to the heart of things. And that takes really, really good chairing, really, really good CEOs, a relationship there to try and make sure that how people take feedback, give feedback, how they interact when there's blame and everything. All of that stuff on an unconscious basis comes back to people and they act on the basis of what they perceive their risk to be. So that is something that I think is just really, really important. So governance, accountability, those would be the things I think that I've seen limits, and therefore you want to spend time getting right.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. Some really good points that have come out there. Alice, can I invite you? Is there anything you'd like to add to Mike's points from your perspective?
Yeah, so again, I just want to build on what Mike's been saying. So I think it's really important to not to suppress challenge as a chair, not to suppress challenge within the room, but sometimes that challenge is not made in the nicest, well, not that it has to be nice, but in the most helpful way. It's not constructive challenge. So I think as a chair, I would always seek to take someone on one side afterwards and just say quietly, that was a bit sharp. Did you think about how it would land? And actually having regular one-to-ones with your trustees, if you're chairing, is a really important way of being able to kind of frame that so that you're not always criticizing them by taking them on one side. You can kind of help them to develop as good trustees as they go along. So don't suppress challenge, but actually the kind of corollary of that is, if there isn't enough challenge or enough disagreement in a conversation at the board about a particular issue, particularly if you think that there would have been and you're surprised that there isn't, then my take is try and encourage a bit more, because maybe we're all doing a bit of groupthink, or we're doing a bit of, well, I'm not going to be the first one to say that that's a load of baloney. So that's really important. Make sure there's enough disagreement, but that the disagreement, the challenge, is made in a supportive way. And absolutely, if it's good, support it. And remember to congratulate. As a young manager, I was once told I didn't praise people enough. It has never left me, and I now try to make sure that I do. And the last thing I would want to say is that when people when people present to the board, it is a big thing for them. But therefore, one of the things I would ask of the executive is that if you are sending one of your staff members to present to the board, make sure they are sufficiently prepared and sufficiently supported, because it's very difficult for board members if there is not sufficient assurance because the person doesn't really know what they're doing. And you can't then you're left in a real problem where you go, this is a junior person, I need to support them, but I also need to make sure that we discuss this issue properly. So make sure that your team are well supported if you're sticking them up front.
Yeah, it sounds very sound advice. Philip, have you got anything to add on this? We're going to discuss a little bit around board dynamics and culture, which has come up a number of times, but just to finish off governance and accountability area.
So I think the one area, I think Mike alluded to this, where a board can fall foul of the trust issue is about reputation management. So we've seen it obviously in the international development sector where boards, quite right, it goes to that point about how do you receive bad news. They're looking at bad news and thinking we have to manage our reputation, and the Charity Commission demands that we report when the reputation might be at risk. And yet they try and manage the reputation instead of thinking, actually, we have to manage the issue, and the reputation management comes behind that because you've managed the issue. And I think that's one of the things that's actually corroded trust, actually, not just in international development, but in some in the charity sector more broadly. So I think for boards thinking about actually how do we deal with the issues, how are we transparent about that, and how does that demonstrate that we how do we use that to manage our reputation so that we're seen as a good charity? I think is something. It's a challenge for boards, I think, because boards, the last thing a board wants is things going wrong. But sadly, things do go wrong, so it's important to focus on it. The other thing is just to say, which still surprises me to this day, boards don't do board effectiveness reviews. Now, that may be a shock, but if anyone's listening and then not doing a board effectiveness review, it really is important you do a board effectiveness review, certainly internally every year, and certainly have that conversation as a board and with the executive. And do write something about it in your annual report as part of transparency and what you might shift over the next year, and then do report back on how you've achieved those shifts. Important to remember as well that the advice is that you should be doing external reviews, an externally commissioned review of organizations over a certain size, at least every 5 years, I think it is the latest. So, we should certainly be looking at that in terms of demonstrating that you are accountable and transparent as a board.
Brilliant. That's great, Philip. Thank you. Thank you very much. The time is rapidly pressing on, but I want to touch on, and all of you have alluded to it in various comments, have been around board dynamics and culture, and in particular of how you set people up when they're presenting to boards, how CEOs react, how chairs react, that good chairing. So I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on the importance and how you can change the dial on those dynamics if it's not working as well as you would like it to. Shall I start with Philip, if that's okay?
Well, it's always harder starting first.
I'm sorry.
No, I knew it was coming. I suppose one of the things is always to remember that board meetings are formal occasions. So I do believe in the informal network building and so on. But I think thinking about how the formality of the board meeting works well. So what is the purpose? What is the purpose of the various things you're doing? What content do you require? Are we aware of what we're delegating and to whom? Are we clear about role and accountability? My experience is that is often implied or forgotten. It's buried in practice and history. And I think Mike said this at the start. Having things written down, which you can then look at and go, well, actually, we're not doing it. Should we be doing it, or do we want to change it, is really important. So, thinking about the structure and flow of board meetings, so there's enough time for the various different elements of board business. So administrative matters, assurance around performance, reviewing and setting strategy, governance and oversight, thinking about those as distinct parts of a board meeting, and then review, whether you're spending the right amount of time on each of those, and that's a constant to and fro that tells you something about how you're working together and whether the business is getting done. A perpetual sort of call from non-exec is around the board papers. The board papers are always too long. I don't think I've ever sat in a board where the board didn't say the board papers are too long. But I think the executive role in making sure that they're thinking through how they're presenting papers so that people can see the wood for the trees and know what they're being asked, why they're being asked it, how it relates to what they've done in the past, so on and so forth. I can't remember who said it, but I think it is really important to encourage board members to interact with each other outside of the board meetings. That's a way of building a relationship and building openness. So it's not about building cabals within a board, but it is a way of actually building confidence. So I've sat in boards, and I remember sitting in some of my first board meetings thinking, I have no idea what's going on here, but I've got a question, but I don't know whether I should ask it or I'll look really stupid. And so, having conversations with people outside, I still find it now, actually, to be honest, with all the experience, I still sometimes come out of board meetings and I say to another board member, I'm really not sure about this. but I didn't want to say it. And they go, well, I was also worried. And you think, well, why didn't we say anything? And that's around confidence. So having those conversations with people around, well, do I have concerns? Do other people have concerns? How might we best present that into a board meeting? So I think building those dynamics outside the board meeting is important, because that gives you confidence. So if anyone out there is a new board member, I've been on boards for quite a long time and I still suffer from that worry and nervousness. So if you're thinking it, we all feel it. So do reach out to others and have those conversations.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think it's having that safe space, isn't it? And going back to some comments earlier, it's about how do people take the bad news or the not so good news, and depending how people react depends very much whether you're going to ask those questions in the board meeting or not. Alice, can I get some comments from you, please?
Absolutely, this explicit contract or whatever I think is quite important. And one of the things that people might find it helpful to look at is the concept of a board mandate, which Tomorrow's Company did. If you Google Tomorrow's Company and board mandate, there is a nice template that they produced. It probably won't exactly fit your organisation, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of questions that you could ask yourselves as a board and you will then frame your understanding of what are we here for, what are the values that we're operating to, how do we create a sustainable organisation? How do we deliver on our purpose? All those sorts of things. So I would really encourage people to look at that. And it sometimes is quite challenging for boards because they look at it and think, oh, we're here to do a job. This is all fluff. But it's not fluff. The one thing to remember is none of this board dynamic stuff is fluff, please. There is no such thing. And one of the things I learned early in Scope in relation to informal time with other trustees is that actually the social bit is really important. I'm very task orientated, hence I don't praise people enough. But I also don't have enough fun, apparently. So in Scope, we introduced something called spontaneous organised fun. And so we had that, it was just a session every month or so, just to get to know each other better. Because if you know each other on a board, you're better able to engage with each other in that way that Philip was talking about, and say, I'm not sure, I don't even understand this. What on earth is this about? And even as a chair, you quite often have to go, I have no idea what this is about. Or what are we supposed to be doing with this? And those conversations are really important. One of the other things I would say about board dynamics, though, quickly, as a chair, is don't talk all the time, because that will not help board dynamics. I heard from one person, I have no idea what the evidence for this is, but the chairs should not speak more than 6% of the time. And I know a lot of chairs who speak an awful lot more than 6% of the time. And I can't bear the phrase, I'm going to take chair's prerogative and ask the first questions, because I don't think the chair has any prerogatives, just obligations.
Thank you, Alice. Mike, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
I like that. I think we'll tell our chair that 6% is the maximum.
Sounds great. I'd also like to know more about this spontaneous organised fun. I mean, that sounds fantastic. So
I'm not sure I can be spontaneous and organised though, but
just a couple of things, just reflecting back on what people said. Good chairing is so underestimated. And I agree, Alice, it's just so important in terms of how people move things on, summarise, and all those kind of things. It's a really underrated part of being an effective board, and I would just re-emphasise that. Just a couple of bits to add around board dynamics and culture. I think most of has been said. We have something called promises, so we've got our values promises because that's the word the children wanted to use, and we used the children and their input to sort of create them. It's one of the kind of ironies that the people who should most role model these promises are the senior people, and they're the least likely to do that sometimes or be held to account for it. And I like the chair conversation, so that the exec conversations are just as important, Alice as well. And I'm sure Philip's had this, behaviour is really, really important. If the children have contributed, the families have contributed to that promises, that's how they want the organisation to be and feel. We should be living that. And that is a bit like sometimes people are sort of slightly strange about EDI and what it means. To me, how you behave is really, really important. You're a key role model. The organisation looks at you, and if you're not behaving in that appropriate way and it's not being addressed, that becomes that kind of behaviour becomes okay, and that has all manner of repercussions down the line in terms of how people feel to be there. One other thing for me, which is there's really interesting about, we talked about challenge and support, but one thing you can't be is too much of a fan as a trustee. So trustees are often attracted to the organisation because of what it does, but you can't just be a fan. You've got to actually be challenging as well. And I've seen this in some cases where people just become unquestioning, unchallenging, just because we mentioned the children as a really good example. There's a whole lot of things that people can justify because it's not right for the children. And it's such a catchphrase that people can use to try and stop scrutiny and stop people looking at things in more detail or keep things the way they are, the status quo. So I think that's, for me, those are key things. And the final bit was just external perspective. Boards and organisations, I think ours, particularly because we provide homes for children, the danger is you become very inward looking. My only other thing would be just think about how you challenge yourself with external views and perspectives, not always the same people talking, because boards can get into really easy, comfortable ways of working, which are not the most effective. And I think both chair and CEO just need to be aware of that and continue to challenge the way we talked about.
No, that's been really helpful. Thank you. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up. We've had a few questions put in the Q&A boxes, and I know our panelists can't see them. So I'll read the first one that's from Bavin. And the question is, with increasing expectations of trustees, do charities or should charities start thinking about compensating trustees to attract a more diverse pool of candidates? And I wonder whether someone would like to share their view on that question.
So I've got a view on this question. I did actually calculate at one point the opportunity cost to me of chairing Scope, just out of curiosity, not because I necessarily wanted to be paid. But I think there is something. I was in the housing association sector when all the debate was on about whether or not you should pay housing association boards, and they are now paid. And one of the things that people say is you will not get the people who are passionate about, you'll get the people wanting to do it because of the money. And I can't, I mean, okay, so don't pay enough for people to want to do it because of the money. And I'm kind of sit on the fence on this one, to be honest. But it is getting very complicated. You are taking a lot of legal liability if you are on a charitable board. And if Swanswell had gone under instead of merging, which was the alternative, then I would have, and I'd been disqualified as a director, that would have been the end of the rest of my career. So it is quite serious. So it is worth thinking about this. We need a better debate. I sat on a pay commission once for NCVO about senior executive pay, and one of the members of the commission did actually have the very strong view that no one in a charity should be paid, which is the opposite. I mean, it's the extreme that I just think is a load of nonsense, because you wouldn't get the Philips, the quality of the Philips and the mics and everybody else out there who's working in charities if you went, everybody's got to be unpaid. Yeah,
that's very interesting.
It would be crazy. So I think this is a very difficult one, but we are not talking about it openly and honestly enough. And I think if we want to answer this question for ourselves as a sector, then it is something we genuinely need to think about.
No, that's helpful. I don't know whether Mike or Philip, you've got anything you'd like to add to that. If I could get you to keep the answers quite short, because time is escaping and we've got a number of questions that I want to try to get through before we conclude, if that's okay.
All I'd add is I think there's always more than one model. and somebody will probably be doing this well. So I don't think you have to have one model, but there's just a catch for me about you create other sets of problems. I understand the limitations of non-paid trustees, but paying people creates other dynamics and may create other problems. So it also is unlikely to solve everything through that one change.
What I might do, Philip, is move on to the next question. And we've got a question from Sue Primer, who's said, how can the board individual trustees engage more effectively beyond the leadership team, not having everything sort of filtered or passed through the C-suite or the CEO, in order to get a real feel for the organisation? I just wondered what your thoughts, Philip, might be on that.
So I'll be honest, I don't know what a C-suite is.
Senior executives, so
SLT.
that SLT.
Ah, I've never heard that phrase before. There we go. No, it's good.
Oh,
It's good to. There we are. It's just
that's a
revealing my
private sector
vulnerability here.
phrase.
Always admit if you don't know.
Good point.
Yeah. So I think it's look. It's important that I think, as Mike has said, that trustees understand the frontline work of a not-for-profit. So I think it is important. Now, it's always a challenge to understand that because, again, volunteers have a limited amount of time. But I think it's important that people do get a feel for that and understand, who the charity is supporting and have some sense of what that is. Now, that is very different from, it's a bit like the sort of, King Charles factor. If you're sort of conducted round places, all you can smell is fresh paint and everything being presented. So there's a limit to that. And I think if you don't trust the senior executive and the chief executive, then you've got a problem. If you believe they are filtering and managing you, then there's a problem, a fundamental problem. So I suppose I don't see that as a particular challenge, in the sense that, as soon as I thought things were being filtered, I'd be nervous. And I think you have to recognise as trustees that there is a limit unless you become operational, in which case you've slipped your role, that actually trying to get into the frontline work is an issue. But I suppose the other point about this thing around managing is, of course, I think comes up in some of the other questions, because I can see some of the questions there.
Oh, perfect.
That you've got to present good papers. And you've got to present, so you've got to manage in the sense of presenting information well. But what you're not seeking to do is to constrain deliberately. So when you're presenting papers, for example, you should be clear about, is this for information? Is it for discussion? Is it for decision, or approval? So be clear about that and offer choices. And you can be clear about an executive recommendation, but you should allow the space. And you should expect that the board will ask questions. Now, you can hope that they ask those in a curious way, in an appreciative way, but you should be expecting the board to ask those things that challenge you. So I think that's the bit that I'm nervous about, where you manage. And again, my challenge always to my executive, when sometimes my executive has said, I don't know why the non-execs have asked this, they're a pain in the neck and goodness knows what. I go, if you're feeling it like that, then actually you're not doing something quite right. So we have to rethink how we sort of engage and work. So that's really what I'm thinking about in terms of management.
No, that's really helpful. And I suppose just moving on, I'm going to have one more question. Others that are in the chat, we will get answers to, and I will share with you, because we're rapidly running out of time. And this may be one from Debbie. She's interested to hear more about not having a managed board. As a CEO, you want to give your exec team, you want to make sure they're prepared, provide the trustees with the confidence that it's a collaborative board. How do you do this without coming across as rehearsed and false, and that you are not managing the board? So I wonder whether somebody can give a quick fire answer. We've only got a couple of minutes, I'm afraid. Maybe Mike.
Yeah, a really, really clear example with it in our own context would be where the executive are preparing their script to go to the board, or presenting one view as a collective versus trying to drive a conversation about the different perspectives and points of view. So, for me, it's fine for the CEO and other members of the executive to have different views and nuances of what they want to say. That's a healthy thing for me to bring out in discussion, rather than to say, we've all talked, this is our view. That to me is unhealthy and unnecessarily scripted.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. Just mindful of time, the questions that are in the boxes that we haven't answered, we will get answers and send those through to you if that's okay. But what I'd like to just do is a very quick sort of wrap up, final thoughts from our panelists on what makes an effective board 2024 and beyond, and you know what the main considerations should be. And so maybe if I could start with Mike.
So basically, to summarise what we talked about for the last 55 minutes.
Absolutely.
Maybe I'll do that in terms of what the others have said rather than my own views. And the two things that probably stand out, the chair conversations I think are really important, which Alice mentioned. You know, the chair has a responsibility to manage that. The conversations about EDI were quite thought-provoking as well, just in terms of the reality versus the words. I think is something that I think is really, really important that I've taken away from this. Actually, one thing we didn't get to, Philip, which I was really interested in, was boards and how they vary across different countries. That was something I actually was quite looking forward to, because there is it's an extension of that EDI cultural point, isn't it? You assume everything happens in the UK the way it happens around the world, but of course that's not the case when you work with global organisations. So probably that's the 1 minute I'd like from Philip in terms of his experience before we go thinking about.
I thought we could do another webinar on that.
Yeah,
so we can cover that, Mike. But Philip, any thoughts on that would be really helpful for this audience, I'm sure, and we touched on it yesterday.
Just one thing to say about so if you take one board I'm on, so the board are the executive legally and they have the legal and fiduciary responsibility, and in a number of jurisdictions the board as we know it is merely supervisory. They're the employer and supervisory, so that's one structure. And of course when you look at it from an Anglo-Saxon perspective, you're saying that can't possibly work, but that's what is expected in that context, and that's how they manage it. If I can just say a couple of things about the you know, in summary, I think that, you know, it's really important boards are aware of their responsibilities and you know, but don't be driven by fear just because you know what your responsibilities are. Be curious. As soon as you're driven by fear, you're moving into the wrong end of the spectrum of behaviours. So don't be doing that. Do have a clear contract. A board mandate, I think, is really helpful for exec and non-exec. I will stop there.
Perfect. Thank you, Philip. Alice.
I just want to pick up on something that Philip said at the beginning, and it's just repeated-ish, similar in a similar vein anyway, which is about that relationship between the non-execs and the execs, and that is really important. The one thing that I think is so important for us all to bear in mind is, what are we there for? Because sometimes by not understanding that relationship, we get muddled up with our own views, and what's really critical is what is the organisation for, what's best for it, and that chair CEO relationship is where that starts.
No, that's perfect. Thank you very much. Well, I would like to say a huge thank you to our panelists. I think it's been a really thought-provoking conversation. Certainly it's got us here thinking about some issues as well, which is really important. And I hope it's done for everybody who's been on the webinar. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the questions. It is such an important topic at such a challenging time, both geopolitically and financially. And Philip, we'll have to get you back to expand more on the sort of international reach of charities as well. So if you don't mind, we'll invite you back, and Mike, hopefully you'll get the answers you were looking forward to hearing. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you for joining our Boyden webinar. It's the first in our series. We will be producing a recording of the webinar, so you will be able to access it, and we will be sending the details through to you. Thank you very, very much for joining us, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.